Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I was searching for AZ305 case studies on YouTube. I get recommendations for AZ305 courses, study material, study cramps, etc. But I couldn't find any case study related material. So today I will share with you a practice case study video. I am going to make actually three parts of it, and I will share three practice case studies. So first let's discuss the format of case studies. If you have ever given associate or expert level Microsoft exam, you would already know the format of these case studies. Case studies are not timed separately. You must manage your time. Each question is independent of the other question, and you have to refer all the information of the case study to give the answers. Let's start with the case study. General overview: ABC Inc. is a medium-sized finance company. Its physical location is in Boston. Its existing environment: the network contains an Active Directory forest named abc.com that is linked to an Azure Active Directory tenant named abc.com. All the users have Azure Active Directory Premium P2 licenses. ABC company has a second Azure AD tenant named dev.abc.com that is used as a development environment. The abc.com, the first tenant, has conditional access policy named policy 1. Policy 1 requires that when users manage the Azure subscription for a production environment by using the Azure portal, they must connect from a hybrid Azure AD joint devices. So here we come to know that we have two tenants and we have a conditional policy. Existing environment: Azure side environment. abc.com has 10 Azure subscriptions that are linked to abc.com tenant and 5 Azure subscriptions that are linked to dev.abc.com tenant. All the subscriptions are in an enterprise agreement. The abc.com tenant contains custom Azure role-based access control role name role1 that grants the data action read permission to all the blobs and files in the Azure storage. Existing environment: on-premise side environment. The on-premise network of abc.com contains the resources shown in the following table. So we have 3 servers, Ubuntu servers which run an app1, and here's some more information about it, that the data storage supports POSIX access control list 5 level permissions, and we have a server 10 which runs on Windows. The server contains Microsoft SQL Server instances that host 2 databases named DB1 and DB2. This information will be used later to answer the questions. So in existing environment, we have network side and network environment. abc.com has express route connectivity to Azure. So we have on-premise and Azure directly connected through express route. Plan changes and requirements. So these are the future plan changes that abc.com is planning. abc.com plans to implement the following changes: migrate DB1 and DB2 to Azure, migrate F1 to Azure virtual machines, deploy the Azure virtual machines that will host F1 to Azure dedicated host. Plan changes and requirements: authentication and authorization requirements. Users that manage the production environment by using the Azure portal must connect from hybrid Azure AD joint devices and authenticate by using Azure multi-factor authentication. We already have a conditional policy regarding this. The network contributor built-in RBAC role must be used. That role 1 which we have earlier read, RBAC role must be used to grant permission to all the virtual networks in all the Azure subscriptions. To access the resources in Azure, F1 must use the managed identity of the virtual machine that will host the app. Role 1 must be used to assign permission to the storage accounts of the all Azure subscription. RBAC roles must be applied at the highest level possible. Little bit more about the plan changes and requirements. Resiliency requirements. abc.com identifies the following resiliency requirements. First, once migrated to Azure, DB1 and DB2 must meet the following requirements. First, maintain availability if two availability zones in the local Azure region fail over automatically, minimize the IOPS latency. Second, F1 must meet the following requirements. So which are the requirements for F1? F1 be hosted in the Azure region that supports the availability zones. F1 be hosted on Azure virtual machines that support the automatic scaling. F1 must maintain availability if two availability zones in the local Azure region fail. Plan changes and requirements. Security and compliance requirements. Once the F1 is migrated to Azure, you must ensure that new data can be written to the app and modifications of the new and existing data is prevented for a period of 3 years. On-premises users and services must be able to access the Azure storage account that will host the data in F1. Access to the public endpoint of the Azure storage account that will host the F1 data must be prevented. All the Azure SQL databases in the production environment must have transparent data encryption enabled. F1 must not share physical hardware with other workloads. Plan changes and requirement, business requirement, minimize the administrative effort and minimize the cost. So that's it. That was the case study. Now let me share with you visualization of the case study. So this is the overall picture. We have ABC company in Boston, which is having on-premise as well as Azure cloud setup. abc.com is one tenant and dev.abc.com is the second tenant. Dev.abc.com has 5 subscriptions and abc.com has P2 licenses, 10 subscriptions. It has a role 1 which provides read access in blobs and files, and it has conditional access policy 1 to use the hybrid Azure AD joint devices. Now abc.com on-prem, it has 3 Ubuntu servers which host the F1. It also has Windows server which is a server 10 and it hosts DB1 and DB2, and both the on-premise and abc.com tenant both are connected through hybrid AD. On-premise and Azure both are connected through express route. So here's the first question. You need to ensure that users managing the production environment are registered for Azure MFA and must authenticate by using Azure MFA when they sign into the Azure portal. The solution must meet the authentication and authorization requirements. What should you do? First, to register the users for Azure MFA, use first option Azure AD identity protection, second option security defaults in Azure AD, third option Azure AD authentication methods and policy. Second question, to enforce Azure MFA authentication, you need to configure first grant control in policy 1. Policy 1 is actually the conditional access policy that we already have. Second option, session control in the policy 1. Third option, sign in risk policy in Azure AD identity protection. So actually the requirement or the scenario says that users that manage the production environment by using the Azure portal must connect from a hybrid Azure AD joint devices and authenticate by using Azure multi-factor authentication. And the answer for the first question, to register the users for the Azure MFA, we will use Azure AD identity protection. It will enforce them when they first time sign in. They will have to register for the MFA. And the answer for the second question is the grant control in policy 1. Here's the screenshot. When you come to the portal of the Azure, go to the identity protection. In that, go for the multi-factor authentication registration policy and select this, require Azure AD multi-factor authentication registration. So this will enforce it. Just enable the policy and save it. So all the first time users will have to go for it. So that's the explanation for the first question. to register the users, Azure MFA, use Azure AD identity protection. And for the second question, we have chosen grant control. So why this is the correct answer? To enforce the Azure MFA, and we need that the users must connect through hybrid Azure AD joint devices. So to enforce these two things, we will have to go for the conditional access policy. In that, go to the access control grant and tick mark these two things: require multi-factor authentication and require hybrid Azure AD joint devices. So in this grant control, we can enforce these two requirements. Second question, you need to recommend a network connectivity solution for the Azure storage account that will host the F1. The solution must meet the security and compliance requirement. What should you include in the recommendations? Now option A, a private endpoint. Option B, service endpoint that has service endpoint policy. Option C, Azure public peering for an express route circuit. D, Microsoft peering for an express route circuit. So here's the requirement. Actually, this scenario is not written in the case study. I have just put it over here so that we don't have to go back and front to find out what was the actual requirement. So scenario says that on-premise users and the services must be able to access to the Azure storage account that will host the data in F1. Access to the public endpoint of the Azure storage account that will host the F1 data must be prevented. So access to the storage account is prevented for the public, and we already have express route connection as well. So if you try to guess the answer, the correct answer is a private endpoint. Here's the explanation. We already have express route connection, so from on-premise network that connect to the VNet using the express route with the private peering, and private endpoint also secures the storage account by configuring the storage firewall to block all the connections on the public endpoint for the storage services. So that will, if you go for the option private endpoint, that will fulfill all the requirements. Now let's go for the question number 3. You plan to migrate the F1 to the Azure. The solution must meet the authentication and authorization requirements. Which type of endpoint should F1 use to obtain the access token? Options are A, Azure Instance Metadata Service (IMDS). Option B, Azure AD. Option C, Azure Service Management. Option D, Microsoft Identity Platform. So here's the scenario is that to access the resources in the Azure, F1 must use the managed identity of the virtual machine that will host the app. Try to guess the answer. You can pause the video, and here's the correct answer: Azure Instant Metadata Services (IMDS). Here you need to understand that we are trying to use the managed identity of the virtual machine that hosts the app. And so the answer explanation: a managed identity assigned by a system can be enabled on a VM. You can also assign one or more user assigned managed identities to the VM. You can then request the token for managed identities from the IMDS. Use these tokens to authenticate with other Azure services such as Key Vault. And as a reference, you can visit this link. On this link, here's the managed identity, and here it is written. You can then request tokens from the managed identities from the IMDS. If you read this paragraph, you will understand that correct answer is IMDS. Let's go for the question number 4. You need to configure an Azure policy to ensure that the Azure SQL databases have TDE enabled. The solution must meet the security and compliance requirements. Which 3 actions should you perform in sequence? To answer, move the appropriate actions from the list of the actions to the answer area and arrange them in the correct order. So we have to go for the correct answers. We have 3 actions to choose, and then we have to order them in a correct order. So options, first option is create an Azure policy definition that uses the deploy if not exist effect. Second option, invoke remediation task. Third option, create an Azure policy definition that uses the modify effect. Fourth option, create an Azure policy assignment. Fifth question, create an user assigned managed identity. Actually, you can answer this question without going through the case study as well, because this is a procedure kind of question. Which thing you will perform in which order? So here's the answer. uh, First, second, and fourth, these are the correct options, and if you if you put them in a correct order, then the first, create an Azure policy definition that uses the deploy if not exist effect. Second option, create an Azure policy assignment. You have first of all created the policies and then you have assigned it. Third, invoke the remediation task. Plan to migrate F1 to Azure. You need to recommend a high availability solution for F1. The solution must meet the resiliency requirements. What should you include in the recommendation? To answer, select an appropriate option in the answer area. Answer area number 1, number of host groups. How many host groups will we require? Number of virtual machine scale sets. Option are 0, 1, 2, 3. So what was the scenario? Scenario says deploy the Azure virtual machines that will host F1 to Azure dedicated host. F1 must maintain the availability if two availability zones in the local region fails. So this one will tell us how many host groups will be required. Two availability zones, even if they fail, the app should run. So we need minimum of how many? You can guess. Be hosted in the Azure region that supports availability zones. Be hosted on Azure virtual machine that supports the automatic scaling. So we need VMSS. So pause the video, try to guess the answer. I have given you a hint. You should be able to give the answer. And here's the answers. Okay. If the two availability zones fails and still app must run, then we need minimum of the 3 host groups, and for each host group we need 3 virtual machine scale sets. So answer for both the question would be 3 3. Question number 6, you plan to migrate F1 to Azure. You need to estimate the compute cost for the F1 in the Azure. If you are really fluent in it, then only this much information is required to answer the first question. What will you need to estimate the compute cost? Okay, but let me read out for you. The solution must meet the security and compliance requirement. What should you use to estimate the cost? What should you implement to minimize the cost? To answer this, select the appropriate option. Answer area, to estimate the cost, use Azure Advisor. Second option, the Azure Cost Management Power BI app. Third option, the Azure Total Cost of Ownership. Second question, implement the Azure Reservation, Azure Hybrid Benefit, Azure Spot Virtual Machine Pricing. So try to pause the video and guess the answer. Here's the correct answer. Okay, you need Azure Total Cost of Ownership calculator to find out the cost. And for the second answer, Azure Hybrid Benefit save up to 40% on the VM, and Azure Reserves instances save up to 72%. So definitely we will try to implement Azure Reservation along with the finding the cost based on the total cost of ownership calculator. Question number 7, you plan to migrate F1 to Azure. You need to recommend a storage solution for F1 that meets the security and compliance requirements. Which type of storage should you recommend, and how should you recommend configuring the storage? Answer area, first question, storage type, choose one of the options. First, premium page blocks. Second, premium file size. Third, standard general purpose v2. And second question, configuration. First, NFS v3. Second, large file size. Third, hierarchical namespaces. So pause the video, try to guess, and I'm going to give you the answers. So you should go for the standard general purpose v2 kind of storage account and configure hierarchical namespace. What's the reason? So standard general purpose v2 supports the blob storage, and Azure storage provides data protection for the blob storage. We need to prevent modification to data for 3 years. So we need a standard general purpose v2 account, and in addition we need hierarchical namespace because VMs that need to access the storage account to they use POSIX ACL file level permission storage on on-premise server 1, 2 and 3 configuration. So we have server 1, 2, 3 which hosts the app on the on-premise, and they need file level permission storage, and only hierarchical namespace can do it for us. So we will go for the standard general purpose v2 storage account and hierarchical namespace. Question number 8. You migrate F1 to Azure. You need to ensure that the data storage for F1 meets the security and compliance requirement. What should you do? Options: A. Create an access policy for the blob, modify the access level of the blob service, implement Azure's resource lock. D. Create Azure RBAC assignments. So what was the scenario? Once F1 is migrated to the Azure, you must ensure that the new data can be written to the app, and the modification of new and existing data is prevented for a period of 3 years. So what could be the answer? Here's the answer. Create an access policy for the blob. Immutable storage for Azure Blob Storage enables users to store the data in warm, write once, read many state. While in a warm state, data cannot be modified or deleted for a user specified interval. Here it is 3 years. By configuring immutability policies for blob data, you can protect the data from overwrites and deletes. Question number 9. How should the migrated databases DB1 and DB2 be implemented in Azure? Answer area: database. First option, a single Azure SQL database. Second option, Azure SQL managed instances. Third option, an Azure SQL database elastic pool. And second question, service tier. First option, hyperscale. Second, business critical. Third, general purpose. So what was the requirement? Once migrated to the Azure, DB1 and DB2 must meet the following requirements. First, maintain availability. If two availability zones in the local Azure region fail over automatically and minimize IOPS latency. So let's see what are the answers. So answer for the first, we need database Azure SQL managed instances and service tier business critical. Here's the explanation. Azure SQL managed instance provide auto failover groups to provide availability requirements stated above, and business critical services tier provide low IOPS latency. So these are the correct answers. Question number 10 and the final question. You need to implement the Azure RBAC role assignment for the network contributor role. The solution must meet the authentication and authorization requirements. What is the minimum number of assignments that you must use? Options: option A 1, option B 2, option C 5, option D 10, option E 15. What was the requirement? What was the scenario? The network contributor role built-in RBAC role must be used to grant permission to all the virtual networks in all the Azure subscriptions. RBAC roles must be applied at the highest level possible. So pause the video, try to guess the answer, and here's the correct answer. We need 2 assignments. Why? We have 2 tenants, abc.com and dev.abc.com. So minimum 2 assignments at each management group level is required. So thank you very much. If you like the video, press the like button, subscribe to this channel. Thank you very much.